Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. A while ago I did, well not a little while ago, very recently I did the how to heal guide, and now I'm going to be doing the how to tank guide. Again, not going into particularly specific things for each individual class, but rather the broader things that you need to be focusing on and thinking about while tanking, because pretty much tanks, much like healers, share a lot of very common concepts and things that you should know and be able to apply, and then you will just be like an incredible tank. So rather than focusing on specific classes, just going on a bit of a broader view. And I have got a whole bunch of topics, a huge list of stuff to go through. And the first thing, much like the healers, is cooldowns. Now, tanking cooldowns, the way you're going to be using these is quite a bit different from the way a healer or a DPS might be using them. For example, a healer or a DPS might want to be combining cooldowns because that will give them more output and just increase the amount that they can achieve. For example, a healer might know that there's a big healing phase coming up, so they're going to be using several cooldowns at once, all at the same time, stacking them together to get more of an effect because of the way that they can interact with each other. The same thing with DPS, where they will be using several cooldowns all at once because all of those cooldowns make the other cooldowns more effective and more powerful. However, with tanks, you generally do not want to combine your cooldowns. There are rare cases in which you want to do that, but for the most part you do not want to combine your cooldowns. And the reason is because you don't work the same way. And for example, you don't want to stack, let's say, Survival Instincts and Bark Skin. You may want to for certain specific things, but generally during a normal kind of fight, you won't be stacking them. Because, I mean, you're taking 70% less damage. That's it's quite a lot less damage. You're going to be taking almost no damage, and then that's going to fall off, and then suddenly you're going to be taking the biggest amount of damage ever. And as a tank, you don't want to be taking a tiny smidgen of damage for a little while and then be taking a huge amount of damage the rest of the time. You want to kind of smooth out the damage. So, for example, let's say that there's quite an intensive phase. Now, the boss is hitting me really hard. Now, I might use, for example, Survival Instincts and then lag and then not use it, but that would reduce my damage that I take by 50% for quite a while, if it ever, uses. Oh, bless you, lag. Bless you. And when that falls off, as soon as that falls off, I'll activate Bark Skin, or maybe just a tiny little bit before, so that I constantly have a cooldown up for this whole period. There we go! And it falls off instantly, because, yeah, there we go. Wonderful lag. And then we've got the Bark Skin up after that. So we don't generally want to combine that, because it's better to have that 20% reduction for the rest of the time. Now, you might want to combine it if there are certain areas in fights where something's going to hit you for like 2 million damage, right? Or something absolutely absurd that you have to use a ton of cooldowns for. That's when you might want to combine cooldowns, though even then you probably won't have to or need to. And generally you want to kind of space them out a little bit. You can use them back to back, but you don't want to stack them all up together. Then you've got nothing else left. Once you've used a panic button, you're kind of screwed after that. As soon as those buffs fall off, you're kind of gonna die. However, there are certain things where certain of your cooldowns can interact with each other and make it stronger. And now I want to talk about, for example, Might of Urstock and Healthstone. Healthstone isn't technically your cooldown, but it is a cooldown. If you have a Warlock, you have the ability to use Healthstones. Now, the reason why you might want to use Might of Urstock and your Healthstone is because your Healthstone restores a percentage of your health. It heals you. And Might of Urstock increases your maximum health. So by using Might of Urstock first, you get a huge bunch of health. Then you use your Healthstone, and because you now have more health, it now heals 4 more. So generally what I'll be doing on my Druid is I'll be using cooldowns like Survival Instinct and like Bark Skin for when I'm anticipating damage coming, right? But with Might of Urstock and Healthstone, that's generally something just hit me so hard, I'm on 5% health, and I need to do something now. Then I'll just go Might of Urstock, and then I'll go Healthstone. And if you look at the way I've keybound them, you'll see how easy it is for me to do those quickly. Might of Urstock is Shift Mouse Wheel down, and the Healthstone is Shift Mouse Wheel up. So for me to use both of those cooldowns, I just go like that, and they're both used. And it's pretty awesome. Unfortunately, sometimes I use the health stone first by mistake, but it doesn't really matter. Those two things, incredibly useful to combine, but most of the time, for most of your cooldowns, you want them to be a bit spread out for your percentage damage reduction type cooldowns as well. And now, when you're going to be using your cooldowns is, of course, another thing. And there are two main situations for this. One is on cooldown, but without wasting it. So if the boss isn't hitting you and your cooldowns just come off, but you're taking no damage, right? But it's come off. Don't go, well, I need to be using these on cooldown, so let me use it, because it's a complete waste. If you aren't taking any damage, don't use a defensive cooldown, right? It's kind of obvious, but I feel like it does need to just be said, just in case. So when you are taking damage, you want to be kind of using them on cooldown, unless you know that there's something that's going to happen. For example, on the Deathwing fight, there was like this giant tentacle that was going to hit you so unbelievably hard that you were just gonna, oh my, if you didn't use a cooldown, you were gonna die for that. So you know, by knowing the fight ahead of time, you know, I need to have a very powerful cooldown saved for that specific moment. And then you will not use that cooldown until that moment. But other than that, you should be pretty much using them on cooldowns. Try to line them up with spikes of damage, so if you know that the boss is going to be hitting you particularly hard during a particular section, use your cooldowns. Maybe, you know, it's got some kind of stacking debuff that it puts on you, dealing more and more damage. That then maybe as your stacks get higher, so you want to think about using that cooldown more and more. So where a DPS or healer might want to be using the cooldowns more on cooldown, tanks, you want to be thinking more of using it at the right kind of times. But if you don't see any particularly large damage spike in the future, use your cooldowns. If you went through a whole fight without using your cooldowns, that was a massive waste. Think about how much less damage you could have taken. But I do find that myself as a tank, sometimes I'll feel like I don't want to use my cooldowns because I want to save them in case of some kind of emergency. But the thing is that if you keep doing that, you're going to end up never using your cooldowns anyway. And yeah, you might be able to have them available for an emergency, but maybe that emergency wouldn't even have happened if you were using your cooldowns on cooldown, because you were taking less damage, the healers would have more mana, they'd probably be able to keep you alive more, maybe you'd be at a higher health before the emergency. You know, there's just too many variables. Just use your cooldowns. You know, if you don't see anything happening in the near future, just use some cooldowns. Don't combine them, try to use them more back-to-back-ish. And of course there are add-ons like power auras. You've got Tell Me When, you can put those, you can monitor them, and try and use the cooldowns more on cooldown. For your DPS type cooldowns, yes tanks, you do have DPS cooldowns. Feel free to use those on cooldowns, on cooldown. It helps build up threat, especially like at the start of the fight. Maybe you want to pop some DPS cooldowns, get some extra aggro right at the start. And but do keep in mind that some of your DPS cooldowns, tanks, are actually mitigation cooldowns in disguise. And I will give you some examples now. You've got Berserk and Incarnation Son of Ursok for Druid tanks, right? And that gives you basically like no cooldown on some of your abilities. And you might think that that's a DPS cooldown, purely. And yes, it is a DPS cooldown, let's not say that it isn't. But it's also a tanking cooldown, in that because your abilities such as Mangle have no cooldown, guess how much rage you can get. What can you do with rage? You can spend that on getting your Savage Defense, so you've got 60% dodge. You can spend that on getting health, so maybe there's like a particularly high damage spike happening. Maybe you want to be using one of your cooldowns like Berserk, and then you can spam a whole bunch of mangles and heal yourself like crazy. And of course you also want to be using your trinkets as well. And so just make sure you've got trinkets on your bars, bound to your keys and everything, so you can use those. For an example, a nice example is Rook's Unlucky Talisman, which is a beautiful trinket. I can't tell you how much I love that trinket, because it gives you some stam, yeah, but you can use it to take less damage from area of effect abilities. So boss frontal cone attacks, breaths, detonation of mines, any phase where the whole raid has to stack up to soak the damage that the boss is dealing in a cleave, because it's an area of effect. Think about how much less damage you can take. For example, on the Immersius boss, that breath from Immersius hits hard. Use a trinket and it won't hit nearly as hard. Not even close to as hard. And yeah, that's pretty much one of the main things I just wanted to talk about with the cooldowns. Also, with your cooldowns, keep in mind of some of the other effects that they might have. We've talked about the DPS cooldowns that are kind of tanking cooldowns in disguise, but for example, let's talk about Incarnation Son of Ursoc as well. It also kind of makes your growl have like no cooldown. So that means that you have a taunt with almost no cooldown. So maybe on a phase where a whole bunch of adds are spawning from every which way, you might use an ability such as Incarnation, you know, and then you've got your taunt that you can spam away, get everything grouped up, and that will really, really help you so much. Another thing, maybe you want to use that at the start of the fight, then you've got a cooldown, a taunt with almost no cooldown, and the boss is going to be forced to hit you almost constantly. The bosses do become taunt immune, so, you know, watch out for that. You do want to actually get some genuine aggro at some point. So, that's pretty much your main thing with your cooldowns. And another thing with the tanks, make sure that you are able to use your interrupts. I'm not saying you have to be the world's best interrupter, but if you interrupt 1 out of every 5 spells that you at least try for, just try to interrupt stuff. Look at how much damage those casts can do, or maybe the kind of effects those casts can have from the mobs on you. So if you can interrupt it, try and interrupt it, because those things hit hard, I promise. There are adds in the Siege of Orgrimmar, these priest guys, that will use... I don't remember the name of it, but basically it'll hit some random player for like 500k damage and one-shot them. So if you can interrupt that, you just saved somebody's life. So try and interrupt if you can. It's not always possible, I realize, you know, especially if you're lagging like I am, just having the world's most amazing lag at the moment with like 20 seconds until Survival Instinct happens. But, you know, just try and use your interrupts, try and use your rebukes and, you know, all those different types of interrupts, and make sure that you try and keep things interrupted and preventing them from dealing damage to you. You know, any damage that you can avoid interrupting is just yet another way to avoid more of that damage, which is of course absolutely fantastic. And you're a tank, so you want to be avoiding damage. Use those interrupts. And now, the next thing I want to talk about is awareness. Now, this is one of the problems that comes in with tanking. Now, say that all of those people over there, they're part of my party, right? Maybe that guy's the healer, and then we've got like 3 DPS that is sort of chilling over there. Now, here we are, right? We're fighting everything over here. This is where our screen is showing. I don't know why I'm using my hands, use the mouse. This is where our screen is showing. We're looking in front of us. Maybe there's like 100 adds that are just completely and utterly destroying our whole party, and maybe you keep getting people saying, oh my god, there's adds on me, help, 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 help. And you're thinking, well, how the hell am I supposed to know? You know, I'm focusing on this. And this is where awareness comes in. Awareness has different forms, you know, making sure to not stand in the fire, that's awareness as well. But as a tank, you have to be more aware, because you kind of have to keep an eye on what you're doing, and what everyone else is doing, and whether anything is hitting them, basically. That's, unfortunately, sorry, you picked the role of a tank, you now have to be more aware. Now, one of the ways for this is, you don't have to have your viewpoint fixed on something all the time. You know, so you're hitting something, we're mangling their faces off, there's like 100 of them there, and while we're mangling them, we might do this. Just do this, just turn the camera around, look at stuff, you know, maybe there's a guy over there, let's look at him, guy over there, let's look at him, people over there, look at them, and you'll just be kind of turning them around, turning the camera around a little bit. You know, you won't be doing it quite so much as this, you might do, but probably not quite as much as this. Maybe more like this, you know, sort of chilling. You know, you'll be just sort of turning to the sides, and this way you're getting a 360-degree view. So, and make sure to have the nameplates, not the friendly nameplates, but the enemy nameplates on. And then what'll happen is, you know, we're tanking some stuff here, and then we'll turn, and there's a guy hitting the healer. Giant red bar on our screen that we can see, and then all we do, select that person that is hitting the healer, kapow, taunt, go back to hitting, then we'll check to make sure that they're coming here. And then when they come here, we'll probably reposition a little bit, maybe backpedal slightly, make sure that we keep everything, keep facing everything, because you need to be able to dodge, parry, block, etc. And then maybe you'll use like an AoE ability, you might even single target it, do a little bit of damage, get a little bit more aggro on it. And just use your camera to move and look around a bit. You know, you don't always have to be looking in front of you. And look here, you know, if I'm looking to the side there, on the right hand side over here, you know, I can kind of see what's in front of me, and I can be watching the party as well. You know, so, you know, just move your camera around a little bit It's not that difficult, and you can keep hitting everything while you're moving your camera around. Keep aware, focus your main awareness on you and when you're standing, and then you can also make sure that nothing is beating up your friends, and you can go and make sure to taunt things and grab things, and even if maybe your taunt's on cooldown, you're hitting these guys, maybe you'll quickly strafe to the side, because by strafing you're technically still facing them, and then you'll select the guy, and then you'll pummel his face in, and then you've got everyone grouped up together in a giant ball again, and then you can hit them. And another way that this is nice is maybe you're over here and you're fighting like a whole bunch of people over here. There might be a caster standing off to the side, and then maybe you can fight these people, grab the caster, interrupt him, and then everyone's kind of grouped up together again. And that's, you know, it's just one of the nice things when you're keeping an eye on where everything is. Maybe there's adds spawning to the sides, they're going to go directly for the healer, you want to intercept them just by moving around your camera. Just try tanking normally, move around your camera a little bit more, and I promise you will get and intercept things a lot more. Your group won't get hit nearly as much, and it's going to be awesome. So there you go, that's the main thing with awareness. And now I want to talk about the next thing, which is tooltips. I talked about it in the healer guide. Read the tooltips, people. Basically, you want to start tanking. Maybe you haven't tanked yet. Go and get all of your tanking spells. Go and look up on, you know, Noxic, for example. They've got like a list of the spells that you might be using. And then what you want to do is go into your spell book, grab all of those spells, slap them on your bars, and then read them one by one. And read what they do. Before you even, just don't even rearrange them or anything. Just read them one by one by one. And then once you've read them all, you're going to see, Fairy Fire applies the weakened armor debuff, and it's got, you know, maybe it's got a bit of a cooldown or something. So maybe because of the weakened armor buff, I'm going to have Fairy Fire on a key that is easily accessible, so that I can make sure that the boss has always got weakened armor on. And then you can see Lacerate. Wow, this stacks 3 times. I need to be making sure that I've got 3 stacks to the boss, perhaps, you know. Before you even look at anything else, just read the tooltips of your spells, and then everything will make a lot more spells, make a lot more sense. You'll see that Swipe deals damage to nearby enemies, and Thrash deals damage to nearby enemies, and they increase the damage based on bleed effects. So you also see that Thrash applies a bit of a bleed effect, so maybe you now know that by using Thrash and then Swipe, that is pretty much your AoE rotation. And just a by the way, yes, AoE for tanking druids at the moment is pretty terrible. Sorry, but it is. And you've got your Maul, and you've got like Bear Hug, and you've got your different cooldowns. Read them, look at what they do, and then you can kind of rearrange them in a format that makes sense to you in your mind. If you've got several characters, I recommend having your taunt key bound to the same kind of key all the time. That way you know, no matter what tank you're on, that button is the taunt. And pretty much the same thing for interrupts, and yeah, your DC. Disconnects for the win! And now I'm going to kind of continue where I left off. And the next thing is aggro, because obviously when you're generally starting off tanking, that's when you have the most trouble with your aggro. And now to talk about this, it's basically once you've read the tooltips and you know what your spells are doing, you know what they do, trust me, the aggro is going to get a lot easier. But that said, it's still going to be quite tricky until you've had quite a lot of practice. Sorry, but that is the way it works. You can't learn anything without practicing a bit first. You can, you know, do as much research as you want, but you do need to practice. And the main reason for that is also just speed. You know, you might know what spells to use, but you need to be using them quickly, particularly in area of effect situations. And the main thing with aggro is the start, like the first couple of seconds, you need to be doing things really, really quickly. But once you've actually got that main aggro, it's pretty easy to keep the aggro. It's getting the aggro in the first place that tends to be a bit difficult. Be quite free with your taunts. As I said with the raid awareness thing, this will kind of help you keep things off of your allies. You know, don't think, you know, you're not always going to get everything perfectly with the aggro. Taunts are there for a reason, because sometimes someone is just bursting one of the adds and you need to taunt him and, you know, hit him single target as well. And with the aggro, I'd recommend the Tidy Plates add-on, as that is quite helpful. It's got like little slider bars so you can see what's the aggro of the different things, and it really helps with AoE aggro. But now, with AoE aggro, generally how you get your area of effect aggro on multiple things is actually through a combination of abilities. For example, I talked a little bit earlier about Thrash, and then I'll Swipe. Right, it's because I'm going to get the bleed effect, and then Swipe does even more damage, that gets me a bit more aggro. And then I'll just be going Thrash, Swipe into my normal rotation of kind of hitting things and work that into it. Now, with, for example, someone like a Warrior, what I understand you want to do is you want to be using, I think it's rend, you apply your dot to them, and then you're going to do like that thunder stomp, and that should apply the dot to all of the things. And then you probably want to be using area of effect things like that shock wave, maybe a bit of cleaving, but not too much with the cleave because I think it costs rage and you need your rage for your mitigation abilities. So there are several different things you can do, like Death Knights for example. You want to apply your diseases, 1, 2, really quickly, then you want to Pestilence to get your diseases on everything, and then maybe hit with a Blood Boil, and you want Death and Decay on the ground. Consecration and Death and Decay work pretty much the same way, in that they don't deal insane amounts of damage, but they do generate insane amounts of threat. So you want to be having those on the ground while the things are in them. DKs you can also be using, for example, Outbreak, then Pestilence, because Outbreak will apply both of your dots, then you can Pestilence, then put on the DND, or you can DND first and then Outbreak and then Pestilence. You know, it's the same thing, you can rearrange it into whatever order you want, as long as you're getting those things on them. You want your dots on everything, you want any ground effects you have, you want to be doing as much AoE DPS and as much AoE threat as you can. I believe monks throw like a barrel of beer at stuff, and that generates ridiculous amounts of threat, and then you can breathe fire all over them, and that's pretty awesome. And you know, there's just like a whole bunch of things. Pallies get their shield throw, which is unbelievable, and they're using their hammer, which does nice AoE damage as well. So there's several abilities that you have for generating AoE threat, and you want to be kind of combining them, and you want to be using them really quickly. You know, the sooner you can get all of your dots on everything, have Death and Decay on the ground or whatever, you know, the better. You really want to have that happen really quick, and that's what takes practice. You need to be able to, you know, press those buttons insanely quickly and accurately without misclicking or anything, and then you'll have a whole bunch of the aggro, and that's what's, you know, it's just going to take a little bit of practice with the aggro. So go and do some proving grounds, go and do some dungeons, you know, go and practice stuff. And now, the same thing that kind of feeds into aggro, now let's talk about pulling, you know, maybe a bit of single target threat as well. Pulling bosses, mainly. Where for your main trash, you want to try and be the first person to pull. That's why tanks pull, right? Because you want to get that initial aggro of being the person who pulled. Also, one of the things you want to do is be ahead of the rest of the group. Not by so much that the healer's on the other side of the planet and you're going to die, because he's not there to heal you, but far enough away that you're going to be able to get a few hits in before the rest of everyone else is. If you can be slightly ahead of everyone and get a few hits in, it's going to be so much easier. You know, it really is going to be so much easier to get the hits in and get that aggro started. And certain classes have things that allow them to increase their movement speed. You know, if you're a warrior, as soon as you can, just charge into those mobs and get that AoE threat. You know, you'll probably still be in range of the healer, but the melee DPS won't be there yet. Maybe the ranged haven't started, you know, attacking yet. So if you can do that, you can get going really quickly. But the same thing with pulling, don't try and go too fast. Also keep an eye on your healer's mana. If they're starting to go you should probably stop, let them regen their mana, and then you can continue going, because if they go you're kind of screwed. So, you know, watch the healer mana. And another thing with the pulling is you want the DBM, or Deadly Boss Mods add-on, and then you can type /DBM, I think it's DBM pull, and then for example 10, and that will set up a timer like this one that gives everyone a timer when you're going to pull, and then you pull, not on 3, not on 2, and not on 1. Now, you should be pulling the instant that hits, you should have hit the boss. And the reason you don't pull preemptively is because it's there for several reasons. It's there so that everyone knows that you are going to pull. It is there so that everyone knows when you are going to pull, and it is there so that everyone can be using things like pre-potting. You know, they might want to be using a potion before the pull, like maybe a second before the pull. So that's why you don't pull on 3, because then they use their potion on 1, and guess what? Now they don't get an extra potion because you were just too eager to start. Just wait an extra couple of seconds and then everyone can get their pre-pots off. And, you know, it just helps a lot with that, and everyone knows when it's going to happen, and people need to pre-pot and everything. And another thing with your pulling aggro, the abilities you might want to start off with are going to be either really hard hitting, or something that generates a lot of threat, and probably a taunt. So, if the boss was here, you know, I'd probably start off with a taunt. Or, what I might do is start off with a Fairy Fire, that gives me the weakened armor debuff on him. That gives me quite a lot of threat, because weakened armor generates a lot of threat, and it means that my attacks hit him harder. And then I'll follow up with a taunt, for several reasons. One is because by taunting, he is forced to attack me for 3 seconds. Now, read your taunt tooltips, because not all taunts work this way. for example, a Death Knight's Death Grip will do the 3-second thing, but I don't think their Dark Command does. So read the tooltips, and you want to make sure that you force them to attack you for 3 seconds. So for 3 seconds, you have 3 seconds of time to just nuke and get aggro, and that way, you know, no one can really pull aggro off of you. A lot of tanks, you know, maybe you want people to not DPS for 3 seconds. Guess what? Your taunt kind of fixes that problem, because the boss is going to have blinkers on, and he's only going to be looking at you for 3 seconds. And with the changes to taunts, it kind of really increases the threat that you generate, like a lot. So by taunting, right before you start nuking his face off, you're going to be increasing your threat gen by a ridiculous amount. So that means that, again, people aren't going to be pulling aggro off of you on the boss. Generally, single target threat won't be a problem, especially if you do this. You run in, you hit an ability, you taunt them, you smash their faces off, and then everything is going to be just perfect. And you're going to have a lot of threat, and the boss is going to want to cuddle you quite closely. And now I want to talk a little bit about the taunting, and I've talked a bit about the taunt now, but also with the taunting of bosses, keep in mind that bosses become taunt immune. So you don't want to be taunting off each other like two chummy tanks, taunt, 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 ha ha ha, because eventually the bosses can go screw this and just hit one of you and then just be like, haha, you taunted me, well I'm going to ignore that. They become taunt immune if you taunt too much in a certain period. It's not that they become taunt immune if one person taunts and the other person immediately taunts, it's if a certain amount of taunts are used within a certain amount of time. So don't be too excessive with trying to taunt the boss, or one of you is going to get stuck with it by mistake, and that's not going to be good. So just keep in mind the fact that that thing is there. It's not something you're likely to run into very much, but do keep in mind that things can become taunt immune, so it is just something for you to think about. And now with the tank swapping, which comes into the taunting, you want to be keeping an eye on several things. You want to be keeping an eye on your stack of the debuff, whatever debuff it is, because when there's a tank swap needed, there's a debuff involved. Always. Or something else. There's always something involved. So basically, if you have stacks of the debuff, you don't want to taunt before those fall off, do you? Because otherwise you're just going to build up the stacks even higher. So don't taunt until yours have fallen off, right? No matter how much the other tank is screaming at you, unless they have a valid reason. Sometimes they might actually have a valid reason as to why that needs to be done. But you don't want to be taunting before your stacks have fallen off, otherwise you're going to cause so many problems. Then you want to be keeping an eye on how many stacks the other tank has of this debuff. Maybe, you know, they get to 3 stacks, you taunt, then you get to 3 stacks, they taunt, and that's nice. And tell me when, for example, brilliant add-on for being able to monitor the debuffs. Keep in mind, guys, the debuff name is not always the name of the ability. It could be something else. So look at the debuff name, not the name of ability, when you're trying to look at what it is that you're looking out for. And generally DPM will also kind of help notify you when people are at stacks of things. But for example, on some fights, like if you look at the 3rd boss of Throne of Thunder, one of the bosses there applies a stacking debuff that at 10 stacks will stun that person. Right, so you want to taunt before 10 stacks, basically. I think it's 10 stacks, or is it 15 stacks? Doesn't matter. The point is, you want to taunt before the amount that the person gets stunned. Now, DPM will notify you, he's at 5 stacks, but the stacks get applied so fast that he's probably at 7 now. So if you taunt, or if you wait for DPM to tell you what amount of stacks they're at, you're probably going to be too slow with that amount of them. Very, very slowly applied debuffs, you know, your general 3 tank swap, you know, 3 stacks of the debuff swap, that kind of thing, DPM will tend to be quite useful for, but because it won't be spamming you all the time, you want to be having something else that's monitoring the FOSS debuffs, like that Tell Me When add-on. And then you can have like a little icon showing you how long is on that tank. Maybe you want to set the tank as your focus or something. Anything that can allow you to see it easier, that is quite helpful. And another thing that is quite helpful is seeing who the boss is hitting, because sometimes you'll think that the boss is hitting you, but it's actually hitting the other guy. And this is where you want to make sure that you have your unit frames have the ability to show the target of the target. So if I select myself, you can see that it's my target is here. This here is actually the target of my target, this thing in the middle, and the one over here is my target. The reason I do this is because I'm generally watching here, because I'm looking at my health bar. Do I need to heal myself? Do I need to do something right now because am I going to die? You know, I need to be watching my health bar. So I put this here because by watching my health bar over here, I can see whether the boss is hitting me or if it's hitting someone else. This might change occasionally. Sometimes the bosses might, you know, throw a cast on a random player. So if it like briefly changes to someone else, don't go, "Oh my god, my threat! Everything's going wrong! Panic, panic, panic!" It's fine. Just relax. You're cool. Everything's good. You know, it's just, you know, he's casting it on a random target. You have no control over that. So don't panic. It's fine. And then I've got my target over here because that's actually not that important. I tend to know who I'm hitting and targeting. And then over here, I think this is the target of my target's target or something. I don't know. I have no idea. It doesn't really matter. That's just, it doesn't matter. These three are what's important. So you want your target. You don't have to have them set up the way I do, but this is the way I like to have them set up. So I got my target's target, or rather me, my target's target, and then my target. So I can see who I'm hitting, whether they're hitting me, who they're targeting, and then I can see my own health bar, which is kind of handy. And yeah, that's just one of the kind of helpful tips that I would give you. And that kind of helps with tank swapping because you know who it's hitting, which is kind of helpful. And now moving on past the tank swapping, it is positioning. Now, positioning is kind of, it's got a lot to it. There are several different things to positioning. Now, for example, if, let's say the Trial Master Rotan, now, if he's a boss, right, generally melee DPS want to attack from behind, because, yeah, innuendo aside, because that means that they'll be doing more damage, because bosses don't have quite as much expertise or chance to parry or dodge or something from behind, and while you'll go for a higher cap as a tank, maybe, the other DPS won't have that, so they'll be like missing him and stuff more if they're facing him, and if he's facing them. So they'll want to be from behind him. So what I see a lot of tanks doing is they'll be, you know, tanking something here, and then they'll be changing their position like every 5 seconds. Why? Stand still. If there isn't a genuine reason for you to move, don't move. Stand still. And now, there are several ways to make sure that the boss is got his back to the DPS. 1. You grab the boss, you keep him standing still, facing in one direction. Okay? 1. Then all of the DPS will run past you, and then they'll attack from here. The other way to do it is to engage the boss, be hitting him, run through him, and immediately turn around. And that way he'll be facing you, and then the melee DPS will run in, and they'll be attacking from behind him over here. So you can turn the boss, or you can not turn the boss, but don't try and do both. Just pick one and stick with it. It doesn't really matter. I know that some people are like, oh my god, a tank that doesn't turn the boss. Personally, I don't think it really matters. I think as long as you keep him standing still, everyone else can move and accomplish what they need to accomplish. Turning him's nice, not turning him's nice, as long as he's facing the same direction all the time. And you've also got some bosses that have both a frontal cone attack, which means you should be pointing them away from the raid, so just make sure that no one's behind you, basically. And sometimes they'll also have some kind of tail attack. So he might have like a frontal and a backward cleave as well. Then people will want to be attacking from the sides. And now this is one of the things I find of trouble on Undasta, for example. He's a person that has both a frontal cone attack and he attacks through the rear. Now, he also requires a tank swap. So you don't want both tanks standing in front of him, otherwise you're both going to be getting the debuff, and that's just... You may as well bring one tank if you're both going to stand in front of him like that, because that's just silly. And you're going to have the rest of the raid stacked up on the side for heals and everything, because they don't want to get hit by either of the abilities. And you're going to want one tank, the tank who's not tanking him, to be standing, you know, on the boss's side, while the other tank is standing in front of the boss, you know? And then, when a tank swap is needed, what's going to happen is you make sure to watch your DPM timers. Is a breath about to happen? Because if it is, you might kill the raid, so don't taunt as soon as a breath is going to happen. Wait for a breath either to happen, or to have a while to happen. Just give you a few seconds to be able to do what I'm going to show you now, which is the tank here, when the tank swap is necessary, will taunt the boss while moving over here in front. Or they might move in front because there's no frontal breath attack happening right away. Then they'll taunt the boss, and then the tank that was in front of him, will move to the side. And that way, the boss, his position doesn't change. No one gets hit by a breath attack. No one needs to move. because the tanks sorted that all out themselves by moving properly. And what I see happen is that there'll be like a tank standing on one side of the boss, like, or it doesn't really matter which side, because they'll get hit by the tail swipe or the breath. And what they'll do is they'll taunt, and then the whole raid group will get hit by something, or they'll all have to move. Here's the thing about raiding. If 8 people have to move with one strategy or way of doing things, that is really, really bad, versus 1 person or 2 people having to move. See, like, the main difference. Think about how much DPS is lost because people now have to run because you were being a bit weird and moving him sillily, when you could just move him properly, and then no one has to move ever, and they can keep hitting the boss, and then everything will be fine. So just try and keep an eye on the positioning of the boss in that way. Now, another thing with the positioning is anticipating what is going to happen. Now, on the Shah of Pride boss, for example, you, as the tank, might be tanking over here, the boss is in front of you, he's hitting you, the raid is stacked up behind. Now, you've got a button, you've got some buttons over here, right? And you're going to have to move to these buttons as the tank. Now, this isn't very, very difficult to do. You see the timer, you know that the buttons are about to happen, you move a little bit closer to them. You're not too excessively close to them, move a little bit closer to them, and then, boom, it gets activated. You need to step on that button right now, you're 2 feet away. How hard is that going to be, really? Just think about that. How hard is it to move? You can even backpedal, and you'd get there faster than if you had to run from here to there. You'd be there in no time. You'd basically teleport, and everyone would be like, wow, that guy freed me really, really quickly. And the positioning or anticipating things, if you know that there's going to be, if you're standing in fire, don't stand in fire. It's like a really, really terrible idea. But also with the positioning, again, like, if you know that there's a breath happening, right, it's just about to happen, don't immediately run so that the whole raid gets hit by it. Just try and keep an eye on the timers, know what's about to happen. Another example is sometimes you need to preemptively move things, or you need to move things because of something they're going to do. Like, some things will plop something on the ground that if they stand in will heal themselves, so as a tank, maybe you backpedal the whole time. It's so easy to backpedal. I mean, I know a lot of people don't like backpedaling, but it's so easy to do, and it accomplishes what you need to accomplish, and I personally feel it's a lot easier than strafing. I strafe when I need to strafe, and we'll talk about that a bit later, but otherwise, if you can backpedal, go for it. It doesn't really matter. There's no time critical thing. And that way, you're pulling the thing out of the thing as he's plopping it on the ground. So you know and anticipate that he's going to be putting this on the ground. You're moving him so that as he puts it on the ground, he's immediately going to be out of it. Versus he puts it on the ground, you then move, then he moves. It takes a lot longer than if you were just moving the whole time. And that way, it's just another way to anticipate things. Another anticipation thing is something's going to knock you back. You got a lot of knockbacks out there, and Thunder King is one of them, and he will knock you so far back he'll basically turn you into a human, or depending on what race you are, baseball, and he'll go for a home run. And you don't want to be standing on the edge of a cliff, because if he knocks you off of that cliff, guess what? You're now dead. Very dead. Just on a whole other level of extremely dead. So instead, you'll position yourself so that you have the boss standing here, you are standing here, and then behind you, you've got a whole bunch of room to be knocked back, and then you won't fall off the edge of the platform. Another area in which you might do this, something has a knockback, but you want to make sure that you don't get knocked too far away. Back to the wall. Oh, you knocked me back. Wow, I moved not at all. I'll just keep hitting you then. So it completely negates the knockback effect by positioning yourself against the wall. So anticipate these kinds of abilities. Obviously, you can't just know psychically, there are these abilities in this raid that I have never done before, and have never watched a tactics video for, so you should watch tactics videos for these kinds of things, know what's going to happen ahead of time, but also just doing it will allow you to learn and know these guys have a knockback, these guys do not have a knockback, these guys have a stun, make sure that I use a cooldown before the stun, or that I stun them so they don't stun me, and that's just anticipation and positioning. And just making sure that it's not really that difficult, but anticipating things generally requires knowing the abilities that you're facing and the encounter and the fight and everything about that. So do your research ahead of time, and it will make tanking things and anticipating things a hell of a lot easier. And now, another thing with positioning is line of sight. Now, what line of sight is, and it doesn't always work properly, but if, for example, let's say that this sticking out of here, this is a pillar. There's a giant stone wall here or something, whatever. And Trial Master here is casting giant deadly bolts of death at me, and I would really like it if he'd stop that, you know. And then I might even be tanking a whole bunch of stuff here. I can't really move, you know, because or maybe I don't have some kind of interrupt to be able to move him to me. But what I can do is, if this is a pillar, I could move here, put the pillar between him and myself. He is line of sighted and he can't hit me, meaning that he is going to have to run down here, and you've just achieved the same thing as if you had somehow interrupted him or silenced him and brought him to you. So the line of sighting can be quite useful. There are some problems with line of sighting, and I don't tend to use it quite so often, because generally as a tank you'll be like, yeah, look at me, I'm line of sighting, ha ha ha, he's gonna have to run to me. And then all of your very, very clever DPS friends will be standing over here, and then he'll be like, oh cool, I'll just select a new target of the ones that aren't in line of sight, and it completely ruins everything. So you can't always use line of sight, but when you can, it can be very, very useful. But you also have to be careful with line of sighting, because what if Trial Master Return was a healer, and I'm standing behind this pillar? He can't heal me. I am on my own. He now has to run from there to somewhere like there to be able to heal you. You don't want the healer to have to do that, because while they're running, they can't heal anyone here this whole time. So you want to make sure to not line of sight the healer. So don't go round corners unless the healer is nice and close and can heal you. Just be very, very careful with that, and we'll also see a lot of that when I do the proving grounds after this, because obviously I'm talking about a lot of these things, and then I'm going to talk about it in practice while doing it, if my latency stops being so terrible, or when that happens. So just be careful with the line of sightings. It can be very, very useful. It can also be harmful, so make sure to use it when it's useful, and make sure to avoid it when it's harmful. Very, very simple in that way. And then of course you know all about knowing the fights, and I've talked about AoE aggro and how you need to be speedy with that, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about trash. You know, the the mobs before a boss, in between bosses, that kind of fill out a raid a bit. So you don't just go boss, 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 you go boss, trash, 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 more trash, good god, there's so much freaking trash, boss, and then more trash. So how you handle the trash and the adds like that. A lot of the stuff with handling trash translates to adds, though. And first off, bosses generally can't be stunned. Adds and trash, however, usually can be. Now, just think about this for a second. You're getting hit so hard, it's unbelievable. If you stunned whatever was hitting you so hard, that would be 100% less damage taken. Just think about how powerful of a cooldown that would be if you could make yourself take 0 damage, and make everyone else in the raid take less damage as well. Now, warriors particularly, you've got an ability called Shockwave, which is a frontal cone stun. Think about how much damage you can avoid if you stun that trash pack. You know, maybe you're a warrior and you find that you charge in and then boom, you're dead. It's just like the adds just maul your face off constantly. What if you charged and then stunned them? You've at least got a few seconds where they aren't even hitting you. So I figure that you're going to be fine for at least those few seconds. Maybe they'll kill you afterwards, but you've bought yourself a few seconds of extra beautiful life, and then maybe you can use a cooldown, you know, like shield wall. Not all tanks have stuns though, so you know, just kind of work with what you have. If you have a single target stun, use your single target stuns. Druids, you have the ability to knock back things with your Typhoon, you know, so that's kind of nice. It can knock them back a bit. They're also slow. It can act a lot, not quite as good as a stun, but it can achieve the same kind of thing. And then the nice thing about that is not only can you Typhoon them, but you can also use the Ursol's Vortex, which is basically another knockback where you can run away, and then they get pulled back into it, so they're now away from you, still not hitting you, and then they have to run forward again, and they're slowed, and it takes a long time for them to actually get to you and start hitting you again. And you can sort of do the same thing with bosses that cast, for example. This is one of the things that, okay, a lot of the melee DPS got really, really irritated when I was doing this, but in Throne of Thunder there's a boss called Primordius. Primordius hits like 14 trucks pumped full of more experimental steroids than you'd think possible, and it hurts, as you can imagine it might. But you can make it so that you can go from taking absurdly huge amounts of damage, from taking almost no damage, from... You'd kite him kind of in a circle, much like this circle, and what would happen is he would cast, and then I'd strafe, and I'd strafe like this, because as soon as he stopped, or I might even run, because he's casting and therefore not hitting me. Again, I'm talking about this a bit more later. But the thing is, he's casting. He's now quite far away from me, because he had to stop to cast. So bosses will catch up to you, and they can't always do this. You know, they can't always, you can't always just try and run around and stuff, and generally, unless there's a reason for it, you shouldn't, because you're going to piss off your melee DPS something insane, and quite rightfully so, actually, because it's going to be very difficult for them to hit the boss. But with me, what I found was, and by doing this, I had these long periods where I was taking no damage, and healers could heal me up very, very easily. So I wouldn't, sometimes, you know, when the melee DPS started complaining about it, obviously my gear was quite bad at that stage, so I was trying to be very, very careful with my health. When they started complaining about it a bit more, what I would start doing is I would do it a little bit less, but he would cast, and I would see that my health is quite low. So as soon as he would cast, I would immediately run. And then by the time, while he's running back to me, I would get healed up again, and that way I wouldn't die. And that was just, oh my goodness, the amount of damage. It was like having a divine shield I was using every couple of seconds. It was amazing in terms of the damage reduction it did. So use that kind of things with your positioning, and it looks like I've been DC'd from Battle.net again. Whoop-de-doo. So yeah, and just, you know, that kind of thing. You can use the stuns, use your knockbacks, run away from things, maybe, sometimes, though that's very, very rare that that will ever be a good idea, and you'll definitely need to have a lot of aggro if you're running away from the thing. And then, after that, we're going to go with be fast on your feet, which is basically, if you need to do something, and you need to do something fast, or if you need to follow a raid leader's instruction, and you need to do something fast, then do it fast. And this also kind of helps with anticipation, because anticipation, when you're anticipating something, your reaction time is a lot faster. You know, if you're, you know, not anticipating something, something will happen, and you'll have to kind of process it mentally, think about it, what's going on, you're going to have a brief period of panic, and whereas if you're anticipating it, you're probably going to react like within like 0.1 seconds or something, because you know it's going to happen, you're waiting for it to happen, and you're going in there to just beat its face off the second it happens, and make sure that it doesn't do what it's supposed to do and hurt you in any way, and you're going to make sure that it works well for you, in your favor. My nose is unbelievably itchy. I guess being disconnected makes my nose itchy for some reason. So, another thing that you can do with being fast on your feet is not just with the anticipation and knowing the fight and listening to your raid leader when they're giving you instructions, but another thing with that is also just being fast. And not just by being fast as in reacting fast, but by moving quickly. And by moving quickly, I mean use your abilities like Charge, like your Monk Roll, like Stampeding Roar. I would say Sprint, but you'd have to transform into cat form to sprints. Yeah, sometimes. But Stampeding Roar, definitely. And you've got your Charge, you've got Intervene, you've got, as tanks, Death Knights might have like Death Grip, which is kind of the reverse of Charge, and then it brings the other thing to you. So, like, let's think about it in the way of, I'm over here, I'm tanking the boss, as soon as the other tank taunts the boss, maybe there's an add on the other side of the room that I need to tank, and I'm a warrior. Let's say I heroic leap, so instead of walking this distance, I was instantly here, and then I charged. I turned quite a long walking distance into almost no time at all, and I was there, and I was hitting the thing, and I was getting aggro, and I was doing the stuff. And if I used Stampeding Roar, let's just look at the difference from, you know, me trying to walk from one side of the circle. That's actually quite a long time, versus if I used Stampeding Roar, can't do it because of latency. Never mind, you get the idea. So just try and use your movement cooldowns. And another thing that I see a lot of tanks doing, apart from me, which is lagging, is they try to be like a DPS. I do it myself, actually. I try to be a bit of a DPS sometimes. You know, you go like, haha, look at my vengeance, I'm hitting so hard. Especially with Death Knights. The way you want to be doing things is not to hit as hard as possible, but to take as little damage as possible. If you have aggro on the thing, that's pretty much all you need to do in terms of hitting it hard. And then the rest of that time should be focused on making sure that you're mitigating. So, if you're a warrior, you don't want to be spending all your rage on hitting the boss. You want to be spending your rage on making sure you're not taking damage, so that like shield block thingy, or whatever it is. And for druids, you want to be using your savage defense, or maul if it procs, but if it hasn't procced, you don't want to be dumping rage into that, generally. It's just a waste of time. And for Death Knights, this is especially true, because for Death Knights, what you want to do is you want to kind of use, I know that you might want to be like spamming Death Strike, Death Strike, Death Strike, Hot Strike, Hot Strike, Hot Strike, spam, 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 hitting hard. there's a different way of doing it, and that is to be using your death strikes for moments of incoming damage. You know, your death strike works in two ways. It heals you for a lot, you know, so it's kind of helpful if you've just taken damage, you can heal yourself up. But the way that it works is it also does more, depending on how much damage you took in like the last little while as well. So you can increase the effectiveness of it by doing that when, you know, you've taken a bit of damage. So what you'll be doing is you'll be fighting the boss, and you might use a heart strike occasionally, and you'll be kind of building up your runic power a little bit. The boss will hit you super hard. Death strike, death strike. You've just healed up a whole bunch. You've now got an absorption shield as well. And then, you know, they'll have to go through that absorption shield. You know, don't wait too long. You know, it's again the same thing as a cooldown. You know, you don't want to be not using it enough, but you do want to be using it at the right times. So there's also an add-on called Blood Shield Tracker for you Death Knights, which is extremely useful. It monitors how much your next Blood Strike or Death Strike will heal for, and what your absorption shield currently is, and all that kind of stuff. And another thing for you Death Knights is you can stack up your absorb shield when the boss isn't hitting you. So basically, one of the things you can do with Death Knights is while the boss is on the other guy, you can be timing your death strikes so that like there's a few seconds left on your blood shield, death strike. A few seconds left, death strike. And by doing that, yes, you're not doing as much DPS, but guess what? When that boss starts hitting you again, it's got to do like how much damage before it even starts to scratch your health pool? And during that, you're probably death striking some more. And you can even kind of abuse this with certain of those effects that I talked about earlier, where there's an ability that's going to hit you stupidly hard. And that's one of the things I would kind of do when I was playing a Death Knight tank. I would have the other tank tanking the boss, and I would build up my absorption shield. And then right before that stupidly hard-hitting move, I would taunt the thing, and it would hit me with that stupidly hard-hitting move. I didn't even have to use a cooldown, because my blood shield just laughed it off and ruffled and just went and told its friends this funny joke about how something tried to hit it and nothing happened to the health pool. And it was just really, really cool like that. So Death Knights, you can actually stack up that avoidance quite a lot, or that mitigation quite a lot. When you're not tanking the boss, you can make sure that you tank almost no damage when you get the boss next. And it's going to take quite a while before he can actually hit you for anything, which is really, really fantastic. And that's one of the things I love about Death Knights so much. So make sure that you time those things. Don't just try and be a DPS. And then the next thing, you know, you've got your add-ons and your macros. I've talked a lot about the macros, or not the macros, I've talked a lot about the add-ons. So, you know, you want DBM or big wigs. And I would also recommend GTFO, which it will go if you're standing in fire. You'll probably hear it sometimes in my videos. I like it. I know some people might be, you know, saying that's kind of newbie to have it. Maybe it is, but personally, some of those effects on the ground, you can't see them. They're almost see-through. I mean, maybe if you've got the time to inspect the ground and do like soil samples, you can know if that stuff's hurting you. But me personally, I'd like to get out of it before that stage happens. So I like to have the and maybe when I'm looking at something else, it just reminds me. It can get a little bit annoying, but it'll definitely help you, especially when your focus is diverted on something else. And it'll help you take a lot less damage. Even if your awareness is good, it'll help you take a lot less damage. If your awareness is terrible, you're going to take so little damage compared to how you used to. So get GTFO. It is amazing. Though you're going to need some kind of thing, speakers, headphones, something to let you know about the sound and the warning. Though if you have power auras, you're going to have something pop up when you're standing on the bad stuff and GTFO is screaming at you. If you don't have headphones, you can have like a power auras symbol pop up saying you're standing in bad stuff. Just telling you. So there is that. And you also, for the macros, there's so many different tanking macros. Unlike the healers, generally for healers, I find that the macros aren't, you know, there aren't very many macros that I'd like to use as a healer. But as a tank, wow, there's a lot of stuff. You know, you might want to have, as a tank, maybe you want to have, as a warrior, you might want to be able to intervene your focus, macro. You might want, as a Death Knight, to be able to raise your ally, your minion, and then immediately Death Pact, all on one button. That is again another macro. Again for Death Knights, you want to be able to use your Lichborne talent, and by using your Lichborne talent, you become undead, which means that you can use death coils on yourself to heal yourself. You might not know about that, it's pretty awesome, but you can use Lichborne, and then you can hit yourself with your own death coils, and that will heal you up. So maybe you'll like build up runic power, Lichborne, Death Coil, Death Coil, Death Coil on yourself, which is again another macro that you might want to have. I'm going to try and find those macros that I talked about in the description, but you can also Google a lot of those. There's quite a lot on it. It's not something revolutionary, I'm sorry. I'd like to say that, yeah, I invented this genius idea, but it's been out there for a long time, the Lichborne Death Coil thing, and that's really, really cool. It's very, very smart use of mechanics, and I think it's beautiful. I love that, because it's just so clever. And that's pretty much it with the add-ons and macros that I'm going to discuss. And another thing is, guys, when you're tanking, don't over-aggro the other tank. I mean, this feeds in again to the, you're not a DPS, stop trying to DPS. Just keep in mind, especially if the other tank isn't like the same class as you, like monks do a lot of damage, druids do insane amounts of damage as well. So the other tank might not be able to keep up with your threats. So you don't want to over-aggro, especially on bosses where there's stacks, because next minute you got 3 stacks of the debuff, then you over-aggro because you're being silly and hitting the boss too hard, and then the boss comes onto you, and now you have even more stacks, and the other guy's still got stacks, and there's just too many stacks all around, and then maybe you might be angry at the other guy for losing the threat, but guess what, it's your fault because you should not have over-aggroed, and that's why you should have Omen 3, because you can then monitor your threats and make sure that you don't pull aggro. Be very, very careful with it. I sometimes do it, and I shouldn't, because it's bad. And you want to make sure, as soon as that happens, you also want to be able to tell the other tank to taunt. But if you're doing it too much, also remember that you shouldn't be going to the other tank taunt constantly, because you shouldn't be over-aggroing very often at all. So if you're having to do that, and they're getting annoyed because you're making them feel like they're a bad tank, you're actually being the bad tank. So make sure to not over-aggro. When they are taking the boss, and it's not your turn, wait for your stacks, while you're waiting for your stacks to fall off, don't ever over-aggro the boss. Be careful with that. Be very, very careful, especially at the start of a fight. And then you want to be able to be using your talents and your glyphs. Certain fights, you want to be swapping out certain talents because, might have... Well, hang on. Let me just have a look at my talents page. For example, I might want the stun from Mighty Bash on certain fights where stun is particularly useful. Or on trash that's Ursul's Vortex isn't particularly helpful on, maybe you want the stun. Swap it in and out for stuff. Make sure that you're constantly swapping things out for what is good for the fight. Generally, I find that this is what I tend to use almost all of the time. But maybe you're using Nature's Vigil or something. What you want to be doing is maybe there's a fight where you'll have an opportunity to use Tranquility as a tank, as a druid tank. Which means you'll want Heart of the Wild that you can trank for a more powerful trank, which is nice. And that's just one of the things. You want to be swapping out your talents and your glyphs. That's pretty much it. As another tank, as a tank, generally, what will happen when you're in a party, when you're with your raid group, you'll have a raid leader. And that might be you, it might not be, it might be someone else, it doesn't really matter. When you're in your raid group, someone else is the raid leader, and, they're leading. But when you're in a dungeon, or an LFR, it is usually the tank who is kind of the leader. In that, it's the tank who has to go first, it's the tank who should be marking skull, cross, what to CC. That marking thing especially, that's usually the tank's job, even when there is a raid leader in the group, because, the tank will know what hits hard and what they want to do with what, and then they can know everything about that. So, tanks should be marking things. Tanks in dungeons, you should be knowing the tactics. If people don't know the tactics, you should be able to tell them. So when you're a tank, you have to be a bit of a leader as well. You have to be able to tell people kind of what to do. And, for example, in looking for raid, you need to be able to sort things out. Anything that needs to be sorted out before the fights. Don't take too long on it, though. But, sometimes groups need to be split in varying ways. Maybe things need to go to the left, and group 3 and 4 need to go to the right, or whatever. You need to be able to tell people what to do. They'll probably ignore you anyway, but you need to do it just in case. Maybe they won't. Sometimes they do actually pay attention, which is nice. But you need to be the person doing that kind of stuff. As the tank, it's kind of your job. It's just one of those lovely perks of being a tank. And another thing is communication. And this is less in dungeons and LFR and more to do with when you're actually raiding. But you want to be communicating with the group, particularly the other tank. You want to be telling them when you're taunting, you want to be letting them know, you're maybe letting your healers know, like, I'm using this cooldown now, I'm doing this at this time, because maybe the healer won't have to use their pain suppression on you if you've just told them I'm using survival instincts, you know, and then that'll just increase that a little bit. If the other tank knows that you taunted, maybe they didn't notice that the boss had swapped targets, now they can go and do whatever it is that they needed to do while they weren't tanking the boss. And that just kind of helps to not just remind people with what they need to be doing as well, but just it kind of gets that whole mental focus for the whole group, so try and do the communication as a tank. Let people know what cooldowns you're using, let people know when you're taunting. If you over-aggroed, let the other tank to know that he needs to taunt back again. Be nice about it because you're actually the one who screwed up if that happened. And now finally, it is time for Don't Turn Your Back. You may have heard this before, but basically, what it is you can only parry things that are coming at you from the front. You can only dodge things that are coming at you from the front, or the sides, generally as well. But if you ever turn your back, you are cancelling your mitigation almost completely, which is a very bad idea, and that's why people will say do not turn your back. Now, there are several ways to do this. First off, the way not to do it is you're tanking the boss, you know, you're facing him, he's facing you, and then you turn around and run for whatever because he's going to be, you know, slapping your butt and it's going to hurt like crazy. Kinky bosses, I guess, but it's going to hurt. Don't do that. There's one way, if you're not in a hurry, and I kind of like this, from when I'm not in a hurry, I'll backpedal. I've talked about it before, I just backpedal. If there's no reason to hurry, I'll backpedal. But sometimes it's, you need to get here now, but you can't turn your back. Therefore, you strafe. And you want to make sure that you've got keys bound to strafe keys. So what I've done is I've got my keybinds, and I tend to move with the mouse quite a lot, and this allows me to attack with my keyboard while I'm moving with the mouse. But of course, while I'm moving with the mouse, I can't really strafe. So what I'll do is I've got W for while I'm moving as well. It's just another movement key. I don't tend to use it that much though. Though I tend to use it, like, I'll press W if I'm running towards something and I need to click on it and target it, and then I can swap to doing that. And it's just, I press W when I'm trying to target, and I need to use my mouse. I use my mouse when I need to use my keyboard. With the movement, I'm not sure how much sense that made. But anyway, moving on. Now with the strafe key, I've got them bound to D and A. So if something's hitting me, it looks kind of like I'm turning my back. Like if they were standing here, where my mouse is now, it looks as if I'm turning my back, but I'm actually, in the way that the mechanics work, I'm not. You can see and notice whether that's working or not. You can generally look here, make sure that you've got like the text on and stuff, and you'll see dodge, parry, or whatever. I don't parry as a druid, but I'll see that I'm dodging, so I know that he's not hitting me from behind, even though it looks like he is. It might look like the boss is hitting you from behind while strafing, but you're still dodging it, you're just moving really, really quickly, and it might look like you've got your back turned, but you don't. So you want to be using your strafing for when you need to move somewhere in a hurry, and backpedaling for when it doesn't really matter. It just does not matter. Another thing is when you have to, another example is that Primordius fight. When you're having to move something, for example, in the circle, you're moving the boss around constantly. There's no particular hurry, no real need to strafe, except with my little trick. But you'll be backpedaling a lot of the time, for several reasons. One, and the main one, is because your melee DPS will have a much easier time being in range of and hitting the boss if you're backpedaling, because you're going to be moving a lot slower, so is the boss, and the melee DPS will be able to easily catch up any distances and keep on top of the boss and keep hitting it. So if there isn't any hurry, backpedaling is the option you should go for. If there is some need to go somewhere quickly, strafe. Strafe is your friend. And another thing you can do is also you can kind of circle strafe, which is where you strafe and you use the mouse to turn, and you can kind of go in a circle like that. You can kind of tie it in a circle or something. So maybe there's something here. This is something you can also do if you're like a ranged DPS or something. You can be attacking here while being a hunter and moving and like spamming attacks. You know, and it's kind of nice because you're always facing the target. Another thing with strafing is while you're strafing, even though it technically looks like he's behind you, you can still hit him. And, which you can't if you're facing away. You can't hit him because he's not in front of you anymore. But in this way, you can actually still technically hit them, which is kind of awesome. And that is it. Wow, I have talked so much, my throat is dying. And I will probably do the part 2 tomorrow, because my internet is being really, really terrible today. So probably no part 2 today, but tomorrow I shall have a part 2, I think, internet willing. I hope that this has helped you out. If you have questions, if you have things that you need to talk about or discuss, you can discuss it with other tanks. I'm sure it will be in the comments section below. And of course, feel free to ask any questions that you might have bubbling around there. I might make a follow-up video, or I'll just try and respond to your comments and, you know, with can answer your questions as well. Thank you for watching. My voice is now dead. I hope you enjoyed, and cheerio.